everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan Podcast. Today, we have with us Maharsh Shah talking about his very first book, Zoravar. And here's something you need to know about Maharsh. Maharsh commissions films for a living, and personally, I think that's all he should always do in life apart from writing books because he lives, breathes, and probably will die by cinema. Maharsh absolutely loves Bollywood, and that clearly comes out in his absolutely riveting book, Zoravar. So, without giving anything away, let's jump right into the interview. Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of the Kitabi Karwan Podcast. We have with us Maharsh today, the brilliant author of Zoravar. Maharsh, before I start, let me just tell you, I finished reading Zoravar last night, and okay, I sent a one-line review to my friend last night who asked me what I was doing, and I just told him it actually reads like a film, and that is probably like one of the best compliments I can give you because I'm a huge movie buff. So, Maharsh, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you, Siddharth. It's so good to be here. This is something that maybe I've actually attracted from the universe. Like I really wanted to be on this one, and you were kind enough to sort of let me be there. And for all the listeners and viewers and everybody, you guys have to know that, honest to God, Siddharth and I haven't discussed this book. So I was really very curious and I was very anxious to really know. And it's via this episode that I'm going to actually find out what he really thinks about the book. And this sets the tone for a great opening. Yes, I've been getting a lot of this that it's very visual. Even some of the early readers who read it said that it's very descriptive visually,
Right.
and it leaves little to imagination in terms of the fact that a lot of it, the narrative has been spelled out. I think it comes from, I'm a movie. I make movies for a living, or I commission movies for a living.
Right.
And I think it's years of reading screenplays. B, I myself, when I started on the business, I wanted to direct films, I wanted to write. So I'm educated in screenwriting and film direction. I've directed a short film. It's on YouTube. It went to the Cannes Film Festival 10 years ago. And, so I think the habit of writing screenplays has not petered away while I was writing the book. And I think that's where the sort of visual description comes from.
No, I completely get what you mean because when I started reading it, I know for me it just seemed like okay, I'm watching something in the theaters, right? It so a lot of the scenes had sometimes they had a Once Upon a Time in Mumbai wala vibe. Sometimes I mean you get what I mean. Like there was like the gangsters, like this slightly suave gangster who has certain principles or things like that. You know, it reads really well. Like especially for movie buffs, I think they'll be able to have that visual in their head because I think that's something all book readers go through when when you're reading something, you just build a universe in your head, right? How certain people look or how certain people act. For example, Zoravar, for me in my head, apart from the picture on your book, which is right here, for me it just seemed like Ajay Devgan from Once Upon a Time in Mumbai. I don't know why. Like that was how he was in my head, like walking with that suave thing. But Maharsh, before we delve into the book, I really want to ask you something. Can you tell us something about yourself which we won't find on the internet or through like the bio on your book?
That's an interesting one. Can I say completely? That's an interesting one. I'd say, can I go back to my schooling days and can I say
Yeah.
about? I mean, I've spoken this once before, but I was just possibly the worst student on this planet, and it was. I think it was very embarrassing for my parents, very embarrassing for me. But there was just no inclination, and I was exceedingly problematic, a bit of a troubled child in that sense. Almost got expelled for doing bizarre things. There was a teacher that who we had assumed wore wigs, so I'd kept powder on the fan, so we'd come and each. So we were just wanted to check whether does he pull it out. Tried and spat on his head once. Just some very very embarrassing things. And to have come from that place, to I think where I've reached or where I'm going is something very personal, and I don't think you'll find this anywhere. The funny thing though is that I was fortunate enough to have an ICS education when I was growing up. It was still breaking out, and I failed a lot of subjects, but my mark sheet was it was like a schizophrenic mark sheet because when it came to English literature, history, and Hindi, I was more than above average or sort of excelling. When it came to everything else, there should be like lots of red lines, and I used to be very scared every time the results would come because having to fail and today I think when I'm on a school group and everybody talks about the book and everybody talks about the movies they make, I think deep down they're very surprised because I think when they passed out of school, I think they figured that I'd probably spend the rest of my life doing nothing.
No, but it's really funny when you mention it because I think the most creative people just have these kind of experiences in school, right? I mean, for me, I am not very creative when it comes to a lot of things, and I was a very straightforward kid when it, but I did do a lot of these, let's say, karnami. Let's put it that way when I was in school. So, but let's leave it at that. I'll tell you more of them after the podcast. Coming to your book, so something that always made me think was we've not had a lot of books which talk about Bollywood in a very fictionalized way, like from start to end. Like you have a lot of books in India which have Bollywood character, like actors or actresses featuring as a character, but never a book which talks about it. So, what really got you thinking about this? Like, what got you to write this book in the first place?
I think Siddharth that people really ideally and because I also commission films for a living, so it's a
Right.
weird dichotomy because my day job is the exact opposite of my night job. I call writing my night job because I'm in office the whole day and then come back home and write.
Right.
And while I'm getting pitched to in the rest of the day, in the night I'm the one pitching,
Right.
and it's exactly the whole reverse. My editor Swati from Harper Collins becomes what I am to my writers and
Right.
directors.
Right.
I strongly believe, and over the years, even a lot of the filmmakers that I've admired, a lot of the writers that I've admired, I feel that most of them, have
Mhm.
faltered when they have tried to do something that does not come naturally to them, or
Right.
they're not the people they are.
Right.
Um, I actually don't have an opinion. I don't know anything other than films.
Right.
Everything that I know in life has either come from reading books or watching movies. I like,
Right.
I mean, uh, I'm a history buff, but everything I know about history has largely come from having watched movies and
Right.
um, I mean, I had no clue about the Goan struggle and the Portuguese thing till I saw Mr. Bachchan's Pukar. So
Right.
my whole sense of being comes from movies, and I think it was a very conscious choice to write a book about the movies because this is what comes to me naturally. A, B, this is the only really thing I know.
Right.
Like if I were to write about anything else, and I do intend to. The second book was going to be something else. I want to do a quick stopgap novel before Zoravar 2 comes out, but looking at the reactions and seeing how it's done, Harper Collins has expedited our deadline on finishing Zoravar 2, so we can bring it this year ideally itself.
Oh, wow.
So now I'm going to have to jump back into Zoravar 2 before I do something else. But anything else that I do will genuinely require research. This is the only subject on which I don't have to do any research because it
Right.
comes from within.
That's okay. I am super excited to read that because last night was a cliffhanger for me because I was reading through the book and I was okay. So it was the last few pages, so I figured you would either end it. Okay. So very frankly, I thought that you would want to finish it off in a standalone way where it just leaves the possibility for a sequel. But but in it also works as a standalone because that's what in my experience I've seen debutant authors do, right? Because I mean, you're lucky enough to have been commissioned the second one. A lot of them aren't. And I was just left surprised at the end because it does. I don't want to ruin this for listeners, but it does leave like you on a cliffhanger. You're thinking about what's going to happen next. But so coming back to what you're mentioning, right? The fact that films is what you know and what you live for and what you do. So now this is something that I ask most authors, and it makes me even more curious in your case. So you were born in the 80s, and the book largely starts off like from. I mean, it doesn't really talk much about when Zoravar grew up, but he's 18 when around the time of partition when the book really kicks off. So, and a lot of what you talk about, like the mannerism, I read your acknowledgement and the author's note at the end where you're talking about how Devanand's, like, all different actors, the way they would be off screen is the key bit for these books, which is very fascinating to read about. Uh, so what kind of research did you do for this? I mean, so there's the thing about being a movie buff, right? You see a lot on screen and you read a lot, and all of this is just like hearsay. But when you're in the industry, you do hear a lot of things and you see a lot of things about the people around you at that point in time. But here you dealt with something that happened like 40, 50 years ago. and people who lived back then. So did you like research or like what? How did you go about this process?
Siddharth, for me, this has actually been um, it's been a build up of the years of having observed, having heard stories, having read, having watched the movies, inane trivia. There was no particular. So in fact, in the first book, I don't think there is a single moment or chapter in which I've had to do conscious research.
Right.
Most of it has been inherent because, like I said, I don't speak in any other language. I would find it very hard to sort of have conversations. I look at people and they have so many opinions about so many things, and it's wonderful. But even on those topics, I think my opinions stem mostly from the movies or from the books. When my father and I are having a drink over the weekend, the only thing we also talk about is the movies. So it just remains constantly refreshed because.
Right.
And now I'm still better off because I've started reading non-fiction books in the last few years, so slightly sort of
Right.
broadening my horizon on other things. Till 5 years ago, I would not be able to have a conversation about anything else. Like even if I meet my friends and old friends and they were not talking about what they've watched on Friday or what is the show that you're watching or what is the new novel that you're reading, I'd just keep quiet because I wouldn't know what to say. I'd find it very hard. So there's nothing that I've consciously researched because all of this has been a part of the years of exposure
Right.
to trivia and there was this gentleman, so I started my career with Mr. Subhash Ghai, who was also so kind to sort of endorse the cover and
Yeah.
just at the when I was at a very formative stage in my career, there's this writer called Sachin Bhaumik, who's this legendary veteran. For the uninitiated, please do look him up on IMDb. You'll be surprised how many of your favorite films he's actually written, or how many of your parents' favorite films he's written. He started out in the 40s with Ashok Kumar, and he wrote right up to Koi Mil Gaya with Hrithik Roshan. So he wrote. I think he wrote over 100 odd movies. Some of the greatest films he wrote for Rishikesh Mukherjee. He wrote for Rakesh Roshan, Subhash Ghai. He wrote for the greatest directors. And when I happened to meet him, he was at the fag end of his. He was in his 80s. Uh, and I remember he would just come every day. He would just come to office wearing a grey khaki suit. He'd sit, he'd drink his chai or whatever, and he'd leave. And there'd be nobody really entertaining him, and one day somebody told me, he said, "Arey, Sachin da aaya." I said, "Sachin da." He said, "That's Sachin Bhaumik." I said, "Oh my God, that's Sachin Bhaumik." So I went up to him and said, "Sir, I work here now." And he was, and then I remember after a couple of days, he told me, "Ke, wo kya hai na, aajkal koi पूछता नहीं है." So, and I remember then I spent a year with him, just sitting with him, and I would sit with him then. And I remember he never acknowledged, but I think after a point in time, he came to office and sat a little longer because of me and my other colleagues who were just so fascinated by his stories. And this is a man who saw the business from the 40s to the 2000s. So I mean, he was a raconteur. I say that if you ever have to be stranded on an island, I think Salim Khan and Sachin Bhaumik are the two people that you should be stranded with because they have enough stories to last a lifetime and more.
That's wow. I mean, that's something I did not know about, and like that's. I mean, I consider myself to be a very like filmy person and very involved with films, and that's. But you're actually very like raconteurs are people who you really really want to be stuck with. But so when you were writing Zoravar, I mean, so I noticed there are a few, like life, like actually few is like an understatement. There are quite a few life-changing moments or experiences Zoravar has throughout the book, right? So were any of them somewhat inspired from your real life? Like, did you try to incorporate a bit of your career struggles into what's somewhat into Zoravar's life to the extent that maybe, I don't know, was Subhash Ghai your Noor Muhammad and
Uh, that's an interesting question. No, Subhash Ghai was not my Noor Muhammad per se. In fact, I would say Swati from Harper Collins is my Noor Muhammad. But while for the sake of fiction, there has to be drama and exaggeration. Uh, and I don't think I've ever said this before. I don't think I've ever said this to anybody before. Uh, I do think a lot of it has come from my personal place of angst, frustration, and struggle to try and make it in the movie business, and in a very weird way. I'm not a dacoit, and neither am I alcoholic or a womanizer. But I do think there is a lot of me in Zoravar in terms of the passion towards the movies, the fact that he's a cinephile, the fact that he do anything to sort of make things happen with the right intent. Um, Funnily, Siddharth, I got to know this after I read the first or second edited draft, and I said, "Oh my God, people who know me will catch this because they'll be like, this is so blatantly you, and nobody has caught it." Um, so, but yeah, but it is very similar.
No, I think
I
I
mean,
think
I
that
wouldn't, I wouldn't, and not to give a spoiler away, I wouldn't drug, I wouldn't give opium to a security guard to enter a studio, but I would have 10 years ago, though, maybe.
yeah, like I mean, and I think that's the thing, right? So this is an piece of advice an author had given me earlier. So I have this ambition of being an author in the future at some point of time as well. And the first piece of advice I was given was whatever you write in your first draft will probably be just you writing about yourself and your own experiences, and that will just feel after a point of time a betrayal to the art of writing. So you might want to change it a lot. And I think I get that because, and that's largely why I started this podcast, because it helps me understand as a reader what an author is trying to do or what he or she is thinking about when they're putting this book down. Something like you mentioned about Zoravar and how this entire book also stems from your personal angst, right? And I think that is why, like, you being a cinephile, Zoravar also translates into being this huge cinephile. And it shows really beautifully because uh, I remember, so the scenes that particularly stood out for me were ones where Zoravar's at different studios, right? Or when he's on the sets of films and he's talking about films. Apart from the plot, these are the scenes which actually were standing out to me simply because of the passion Zoravar had. The way he spoke about mundane things such as sets or, giving direct something as basic as the description of the crane that was coming in and how fascinated Zoravar was with the entire idea. It just goes on to show how where the character is coming from. So, Maharsh, I actually had a question about. So when you were writing Zoravar, and so as you mentioned that it does come from your personal angst. But were you at any point trying to incorporate like elements of known actors or actresses into the book, like stuff that you would know of people struggling from that era? You know, conscious. Did you consciously try and put certain things into it? I asked this question because um, some of the traits that Zoravar demonstrates are very, very common in the film world, at least from my outsider perspective that I understand. Particularly the bit about, uh, this overhyped way of telling people that, there aren't any friends or permanent enemies in the film industry, and how he's very always sad about another person's movie doing really well or his peers' movies doing, going ahead of him and stuff like that. So, were there any particular instances or characters that you based it on in real life, or was it just something that you?
No, it's a multitude of real life characters.
Right.
And for legal hygiene, we may not be able to sort of take those names, but Zoravar really is a mixture of a lot of real life actors, to be frank.
Right.
And then at the end of it, what happens is, when you take five personalities, for example, and you merge five different characteristics of a personality, the amalgamation gives you a completely brand new, fresh fictional opportunity, which is what I think Zoravar truly is. And then when you spoke about the crane, for example, the Chapman crane or the Michelle film cameras, those were things that actually are not me in that sense, in the sense that, I didn't necessarily have such a fascination the first time I walked into a movie set, but because I wanted to create that sort of world, um, the struggle was to try and explain it um, to a layman reader, to people who do not understand the techniques of filmmaking or the internal workings. And I remember my editor and I went back and forth on a lot of these descriptions because she said, "Hey, the rest of the book is like full fiction drama. But every time these descriptions come in, it just feels like you're reading a Wikipedia page or a textbook on camera or editing or filmmaking." So I had to rewrite those portions to make them more palatable. Because otherwise, what separates this book from any other book on films? I just didn't want to make it about. I didn't want to make it like, and there's no harm in it. I didn't want to make it like a magazine article, if you know what I'm saying. I wanted to read. I wanted it to be, while the endeavor is on entertainment, and it's hard pulp fiction. The format is not meant to. It's like and I'm sorry to a lot of authors, but Ernest Hemingway once said that if I want to send a message, I'll go to the post office. So I don't want to use my stories to bring about. I just want to entertain and hopefully inform. So a lot of those descriptions came because of that. That let the book be a little more than just something that, like you, for example, very correctly pointed that everybody knows that there are no permanent friends or enemies in the film business. But when you read about the Bene Israelis, or when you read about how the movie business, the silent era, was actually started by by the Jewish people, I think those are things that add a little flavor to the things that readers already know about.
Right. And so, Maharsh, before I ask you the next question, I'll actually ask you a question which somewhat gives some context to the next one. Tell me about the books that you read, or like what are the books that have stood out for you over the years of reading, maybe, and could be fiction, non-fiction, because that'll just give me some more context for my next question.
So I find it very hard to read non-fiction, which is the opposite, because I'm told that in India in particular, non-fiction outsells fiction by a massive margin, and Indians, we as a race, just somehow read more non-fiction, whereas I cannot read non-fiction at all. I've started now. I mean, I'm I'll be frank. I mean, it's still a struggle to me to finish non-fiction books unless it's about really interesting people. I find it very hard, to be honest. So fiction is my thing. I read. I try and I do that Goodreads challenge, and sometimes that pressure is what sort of propels you. So it's great fun. But yeah, I read mostly contemporary and historical fiction. So I'm in love. All I've been doing is stare at the book rack. So I'm seeing you've got Madeline Miller's book there. You've got All the Light We Cannot See. You've got Murakami there. You've got Game of Thrones. My God. So this is like the best company for Zoravar to be in. And there's Low that I've just started reading. Jeet Thail's Low is something that I've just started 3 days ago. So that's the one that I'm currently reading.
Okay.
And I also and I never read one book at a time. I cannot. So I'm generally in the middle of 3 books, and then depending on the mood or frame of mind is. So I'm currently reading Low. I'm reading Richard Osman's Thursday Murder Club, and I've just started the Elon Musk book.
So that's actually a very fascinating thing, and to be very honest, it's completely fine to not want to read non-fiction or like struggling with it, because at the end of it, I personally have this idea that if you are not into a particular kind of genre or a book, you should not or will not, unless like it serves an external purpose to you, like need it for work or for research, you really shouldn't get into it. Because
very well said, said, and thank you. I needed to hear this. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of it, reading is, unless you're enjoying the activity, it serves no purpose in your life, right? And the Goodreads challenge, that's actually very funny, because the Goodreads challenge is something that I particularly use as well. And the entire idea for Kitabi Karwan was somewhat rooted in this as well. That I used to read a lot, and in the middle I kind of lost track of how much I was reading, or it really went down. So I kind of thought that okay, maybe I can just start this page off as a hobby and like just keep posting there just to keep myself motivated. Like so I read, I like post something there. So I need to do this amount of work for this page, and it just like exploded from there. So that's just it's just funny how things take you at a different place. But the reason I asked you this question was very simple. So there's this school of thought, right? Like that's a huge debate in the country right now, especially since the early 2000s, where you've had the emergence of a lot of Indian fiction writers who aren't necessarily or classically literary in the sense of that word, right? I mean, you have your Arundhati Roys and Anuradha Roys and everyone coming up who like absolutely excellent books nominated for the Bookers and everything. And then you have authors like, say, your Chetan Bhagats, your Durjoy Dattas, right? And I personally have changed my stance on this a lot. I've gone from being like a hater, not a hater, but let's say like a huge critic of, say, the general pulp fiction writing or like, just story narratives, to being a person who actually like, okay, these stories have their importance and they have their audience, and it does form a huge part of it. It's actually a huge classist question that comes in. And that's why I wanted to ask you this question, because often writers are people who read a lot and they try to aspire to their own literary heroes, right? So that's what I wanted to ask you. When you were writing Zoravar, were you ever feeling pressured about conforming to a certain literary style, Or like for example, you mentioned you're reading Low by Jeet Thayil. Jeet Thayil's writing style is absolutely different from anything that you'll ever read in life, right? So and when like I mean I have those moments, right, when I read something by Chital and the next thing I'm trying to write a short story and I say, oh, this is just like this is not even worth publishing on a blog, let alone a book, right? That's a feeling that I get, and then it takes me like a few hours to kind of get over it. So was this pressure something that you ever felt, or is it something, and do you feel this way in real life as well, like when you're picking up something to read, is there ever this conflict whether the kind of author that I'm reading or should I read a particular kind of book?
No, so the funny thing is, I've actually, I also had a bit of a, and I'm apologetic for it, but I had a very entitled superiority complex when it came to Indian authors. I never read them, to be frank. I think Five Point Someone was possibly the only book back in the day, I mean, 15 years ago when it came out, is when I read.
Right.
But other than that, Ashwin Sanghi, Amish, our authors. I'm just discovering Chitra Banerjee and Anuja Chauhan now, but that's more because I'm in the publishing business, and we
Right.
share the common. We have Harper Collins in common. Richa Mukherjee. So I'd never. So I had arrogance towards it. I'd only read American authors or British authors or books translated from the rest of the world. Um, Murakami is one of my favorite authors of all time. So is Hemingway. So is Fitzgerald. So that's the kind of space that I really really like. Agatha Christie, of course. Um, but the thing is, making mainstream films all your life is, and this comes to me inherently even when I was in film school. So,
Right.
um, I believe that what you watch and what you read
Mm-hmm.
do not have to be things that you create. I could speak about as much eloquence about William Shakespeare or Murakami or
Mm-hmm.
Arundhati Roy or Amitabh Ghosh, for example.
Right.
But it does not mean that I have to. You have to realize whether you have the aptitude to write like that. And when I say aptitude, what I don't mean it in a demeaning way. What I mean to say is that people who like me who write mass paperbacks or intend to write pulp fiction novels, I think that is also an art that unfortunately it's like the movies. It's like an action comedy that makes 250 crores will never get the respect that a film like Thappad gets. That closes at 30 crores, for example. Um, but I don't get this disdain towards mass and mainstream because at the end of the day, if your story, I just think that there should be no judgment on stories. I don't think, and this was my own this own peculiar strangeness to my perspective that I had to rectify, and it actually came with starting off with Ashwin Sanghi, and I had this crazy phase, and I just after a point figured that reading him is actually so much fun. Um, it's just great fun to read those books. It's like you're watching a great masala movie,
Right.
and why should there be disdain? The thing is, my love over writing is for reading and for watching films, and I like to read everything.
Right.
There are some authors that I won't name that I still haven't read. Some of them that you mentioned, and I've tried, and I cannot for the life of me read. But that's
Right.
not because I have arrogance towards it. It's because my sensibilities don't
Right.
gel with that kind of writing.
Right.
But with Zoravar, a and I'll be very frank, I don't think I have the aptitude to do the kind of literary, the metaphorical, the poetic way that a lot of the writers that you mentioned write.
Right.
Uh, B, that is honestly not even my intention, to be frank. Uh,
Right.
the day I can do an off novel like that, I'll give it a shot, and maybe it'll backfire, maybe it won't, and then I'll just come back to comfort food writing. But I do believe that uh, in a country like India, because if
Right.
you look at Australia, if you look at America, if you look at UK, I've seen some of the numbers because I'm beginning to sort of understand somewhat the functions of how the publishing world works. More books have been read in those countries than they, and there's been a huge spurt of growth. Even in India, there's been a huge growth of spurt in reading,
Right.
and you have to give it to people like Amish and Chetan Bhagat and Durjoy and the people that you mentioned for Anuja Chauhan for bringing that. At least
Right.
people are reading. I think I
Right.
think right now it's very imperative that people walk into a bookstore and buy a book or they order it on Kindle or whatever. I'll tell you why, Siddharth. I feel Indians have this particular disdain towards reading in general.
Right.
I think it's to do with our education system. Children have been. The problem is that reading takes people back to their schools and colleges. textbooks. They
Right.
don't look at it in India as an entertainment outlet,
Right.
unfortunately. And
Right.
I think that the more massy work that comes out will hopefully
Right.
propel people towards. And when I say massy, I'm not saying it has to be completely low IQ.
Right.
I'm not saying it has to be completely for the layman. There could be
Right.
a certain aesthetic to mass paperbacks also.
Yeah, of course. Because personally, I think I'm glad you mentioned Anuja Chauhan. She's one of my favorite authors, and reading her work was instrumental in me changing my opinion from because so I don't know how many books by Anuja Chauhan you've read, but she has a very peculiar style where she does not hesitate in using your everyday words, regardless of whether they're in Hindi, Urdu, or English, or even Punjabi, for depending on where the characters are, into her books, right? So she would and so when I was reading her books for the first time, it felt so familiar and it felt so natural to read through that book, and that's something that kept me up with Zoravar as well, right? And it's very refreshing to read authors like this because there's just two ways of looking at it. One is an educative exercise when you're trying to, like, as you mentioned, as Ernest Hemingway said, if he wants to send a message, he'll go to the post office. That's an educative exercise. You're trying to gauge something out of the book. It says this deep message about whatever issue that they're trying to talk about. But often stories give you messages without actually being, you know, trying to hide something. Like something I took away from Zoravar was the fact that one of his biggest undoings at all points in his life was trying to outdo not himself, but people around him. Like there were so many things that were going well for him, and he could have done. I mean, I don't need you to be a very literary Shakespearean author to kind of tell me that message. I get it from a very naturally entertaining story. So I mean, I completely get that, and so yeah, that's that. But what brings me to the next bit is where your worlds collide, right? Like as someone who commissions film for a living, right? How do you how do you go about like distinguishing your writing from screenplays? I mean, it's a different thing to read like a screenplay, and a very different thing to actually just write a screenplay, right? So, because you're for a very long time that you were exposed to the screenplays at work, how was it that you managed to like write a book which actually sounds like a very brilliant book?
It's again, I think it's mostly subconscious. I think two Japanese people that I admire a lot. One is Murakami, and the other is Akira Kurosawa, the great filmmaker. I think they both said something very similar. They said that read everything that there is to read, and watch that there is everything to watch, and then embark upon your journey. You know what? That in retrospect now, when I look back, and I was glad that I took that advice very seriously when I was very when I was in my very younger years, and I strongly stick by it. I think that by the time, if you've read enough and if you've watched
Right.
enough, uh, when you embark on your journey, uh, you'll be shocked at how subconsciously the narrative flows while you're sitting in front of the computer. And there are a lot of books on screenwriting, and personally, I don't disrespect anybody who follows them, but I don't believe in it. I've
Right.
studied books on screenwriting, and I've read a couple of things on how to publish a novel. And Anjum Rajabali, the great screenwriter, he was my teacher in film school, and he said, you can study Sid Field and you can study all these screenwriters, but eventually, and I remember he held his tummy and he pinched it and he said, eventually all your writing is coming from here, from your gut.
Right.
Um, and and however and however generic this sounds, it's true, because,
Right.
for example, if you look at the classic American sitcom writing, or if you look at some of the James Patterson type of, they've got those formats of writing. They say that on every ninth page you got to have a gag, or every 12th page you got to have
Right.
construction in a way that you've got a new twist, or
Right.
a chapter has to end in a certain way. I think when you've read and watched enough, your gut will tell you subconsciously on where the plot is meandering and where it's not.
Right.
I don't think you need formal education for it.
Right.
So I just think I strongly believe that to become a writer or to become a filmmaker, I think it's very important to be a voracious reader and be a cinephile first, till a certain point in your life. Unless you're just born from your mother's womb like this incredibly talented person, then I mean, kudos and good for you. But I do think that it largely comes from watching, and this is the only medium that allows us to do this. With cricket,
Right.
for example, It's not like if you watch 100 hours of cricket, you'll be able to play physical cricket, or if you, like if you watch a stock trader trading stocks, it's not like you're going to become a trader yourself. But with books and with movies, the more you watch and the more you read, it actually pivots you into becoming,
Right. And it's very fascinating when you bring this up because uh, this is something I have noticed as someone who watches movies and in the past decade, like web series and shows on the internet, to the extent that what I feel is that a lot of modern Indian content, like the content that's coming from newer filmmakers, is actually breaking those exact rules that you're mentioning, right? Like, I mean, things like having a gag on every 9 to 12 page. I'm not very familiar with it, but I'm taking over word for it. I think you're seeing organic content, like, I mean, things where unconventional stories, not funny in the face of it, but incorporating humor to everyday life. Stories which generally people won't be talking of, mainstream stuff won't be talking about. And I think that's where the beauty lies, right? I mean, no one would ever have thought something like this would succeed, but these things are working out. And that's I think the beauty of storytelling, whether it's like through a book or through movies. It's sometimes you just want to hear a very good story and you don't really care about the format in which it's told you. So I mean, that takes me to the other bit. Have you ever, yeah,
also, if a story is entertaining enough, why should the format matter? We all grew up traditionally. Like I say that, our grandmas are the greatest storytellers ever, because or people who sing you lullabies are your first exposure to story, right? Because today I have, my daughter needs YouTube to eat her food. What is that? That's nothing but an affinity towards stories eventually, and the format doesn't matter. If most places in our country at least, it's your grandmother or your mother who always read a book out to you, or read, or told you about the grandmama's tales. The format didn't matter then. Why should it now? As long as it entertains and as long as it informs, as long as you're enjoying it, why be apologetic about what the format is?
right. And exactly why I think right now there's this. I think a lot of people are buying into this very idea now. Like, are very accepting of this idea that the format really doesn't matter. Like something like how podcasts have exploded or how audiobooks have exploded. It's everyone is just ready to experiment as long as the content is good, whatever you're getting out of it, whether it's through your traditional forms or untraditional ones. But that actually brings me to my next question. What have you thought about Zoravar's future? Do you think there is a movie or a web series? Is that a possibility that crossed your mind? I mean, you do this for a living. I'm sure it's something that would have played on your mind even while writing it.
So actually, it didn't. To be honest, it didn't at all, because my dream was to write a novel. My dream was to write a book, and I'm fortunate to have gotten published, by people like Harper Collins. And the funny thing is, and I get this every time, that you've structured this like a series. It's so evident that you've written this like a story, like a movie. The weird thing is, and I think it's there over analysis somewhere, because I swear, when I was writing it, I just wanted to be a published author. Iske aage kuch ho na ho, it's okay. I've written my book. Once you're on the stands, I don't know, was it Fitzgerald or one of the writers from the 40s who said this interesting thing. This is like, hey, once you're on the stands, you're an author for life. That goes on your bio, and it'll go on your grave. So I had I didn't do this consciously. There have been a few offers. We've been fortunate that a lot of people are seeing it as a series more than a film, because you've read book one, and it'll be very difficult to assimilate all of that into a 2-hour film. B, there is part two, and if part two sells enough, then hopefully part three of Zoravar as well, where the story would finally resolve. But I have genuinely, consciously not once wanted to, because I'll tell you where that comes from. Because for somebody like me, I'm saying I'm already making series and movies, so everything that I write does not have to necessarily translate into video. So I wrote this only for publishing. In fact, honestly, if I were consciously writing this for series or films, I think I would have added an extra layer of drama, which I think is lacking right now.
Actually, I think where I think I see where it's coming from. So again, my first reaction also was like, oh, it reads like a movie, which I love. Like, I love that fact that it reads like a movie. But I think, as your professor mentioned, like aata yahan se hai. And I think that's been what your life is, and I kind of relate very hard with it. That when you've been, I think if I end up writing something, it will sound something like Zoravar. because I too love films, right? And when I do, and so it's not that I would intend to write it as a film, but because that is something that I'm so passionate about, and it's something that I constantly do, it just will play out in that particular way, and which is fine. I mean, that's that, as you mentioned throughout this interview, like I do take away this image of this person who lives for cinema, and obviously your work will sound something like that is cinematic, right? So I mean, no one, I mean, I don't think there are any complaints there. It's just like a very fun thing to think of. So Marsh, what do you do apart from like films and books? I know you say that this is all your life, but like any other hobbies that you go for? Or...
I mean, nothing. Like I don't have a life. There was a phase in my life, Siddharth, where I was in college again. Those were genuinely years of decadence, so as to speak. Um, Somehow got through 5 years, even I don't know how. Lots of 80 KTs and just
Right.
spillover. So I'd been SY BCom, still having to clear two exams, two topics, economics and all, ghastly. Also, I should have taken arts at a time where I took commerce. So I'm saying, it was also, but it's sorry, I just lost you for a second there.
I was just asking for your hobbies. I kind of
Hobbies. Sorry, yeah, no.
Yeah.
So there was a phase in my life where and people find this hard to believe, but it's really true. I think there were about 3 years in my life before I went to film school, and before I went to MICA. I did nothing else. I just watched, and those were the DVD days, the DVD rental days. We had the subscription to Big Flicks. I'd watch close to 4 films a day, and this lasted for almost 2 years. I didn't go out.
Wow.
I barely. I mean, the friends that I met. But so this was my life cycle. So I'd wake up at around 1:30 or 2 in the afternoon. I'd start one movie for the day, finish that, and while have my lunch or whatever during that at about 4:30, and then at 5 I'd start the second one. By the time dinner would be ready to roll out, I'd start the third one. Then I'd watch a fourth one. Then I'd read, and this was years ago. So this is when I was still also, So those are some of the greatest fun moments of my life, because I was reading, I was discovering Jeffrey Archer, Mario Puzo, Sidney Sheldon, Ludlum. So that's the era where I sort of just polished off everything written by all these people. And at the same time, I was watching films. And this is all I did. But in terms of hobby, and I've realized that as we evolve, and I won't use the word aging or getting older, I think we evolve. As one evolves, certain interests start finally, So now I'm very interested in fitness. The pandemic, taught me, and I know Zoravar, which is one of my favorite lines from Zoravar, who says, nothing interesting comes from a calm mind. Meditative mind is no work of true art, and I believe that true intense work of art can only come from chaos. It's like Dan Brown says, order from chaos. I do believe that a meditative mind cannot truly create great art, and I know this is a very controversial, unpopular opinion, but I believe that. But during the pandemic, meditation is something that I started sort of getting into. Traveling is something that I really, really, truly enjoy. But yeah, other than that, I do a podcast that tells you what series to watch. I write books and I make films. So I don't think there's any space to do anything else.
So, that's very interesting for you to point out, because it just makes me think of this one particular instance. So I had the pleasure of interviewing Anuja Chauhan for the first season of this podcast. And so she's one of the authors who's had a lot of works adopted into movies or web series, right? The most recent one being the Zoya Factor, I think.
Zoya Factor.
Right? And she spoke about how she was not very happy with how the movie turned out. So now, as someone who reads a lot, someone who's now also a published author, someone who commissions movies, I don't know if you commission web series, but where do you think is the lag? Because this is a complaint which I think a lot of authors, a lot of readers also share, right? It's very rare for an author or a reader to, look at an adaptation and go like, oh, okay, this lived up to our expectations of what we thought it should be, right? Like, I mean, those movies or web series might work for, with the audience that doesn't read, who just find the story very attractive. But for readers, more often than not, it's a failure. Do you think, I mean, where are we failing? Where's the disconnect happening?
So I'll tell you what, that's a great question. And I've often thought about this. So I have this personal bias. If I've read the book first, I don't watch its on-screen adaptation. ever. I've never done this. So like last year, everybody was going gaga about Sally Rooney's Normal People adaptation, the video adaptation. I didn't watch the series because I read the book first, and I had known. So and there have been moments like Gone Girl. Gone Girl is a film that I haven't watched because I read the book before the movie came out. I think movies and series never live up to the original. I mean, even Game of Thrones is a far more enjoyable read than a film. There are only three, in my opinion, that stand out over that tower above the book. A is Christopher Nolan's The Prestige, which I think is a far better film than the book it was based on. I think I think Coppola's The Godfather is a film that is actually slightly better than the book. Um, these two, I mean, so I'll tell you where the lag sort of comes from. I think is that it's an individual subjective medium. When you're reading, it's your vision. You're the visionary, and that's the great thing about reading because you're building that in your head. Zoravar, for example, might read very different to you than it might read to your friend, for example, in terms of the worlds that you inhabit. So if he's walking, when Zoravar gets off at the CST, the VT station for the first time, the way you'd see the paraphernalia around it would be very different from another reader. The same way, when a writer or a director adapts that book to screen, it's his or her imagination of it, which differs from your imagination because we all have subjective opinions and very different minds. So I think the lag comes from there, and B, the thing is from word to screen, and this is a lot. There are a lot of vociferous discussions on this. Word to screen has had a miserable history from time immemorial. R.K. Narayan watched Guide, which is considered to be one of the greatest Indian films of all time, and he called it the misguided guide in a
You mentioned it in the
he hated it. Yeah. Stephen King, and this when Stanley Kubrick adapted The Shining from Stephen King's great novel, and The Shining is one of Kubrick's greatest films. The Jack Nicholson and Stephen King was very upset and he was very depressed and he was very abusive about how the film shaped up. I don't think Dan Brown is happy with the way Ron Howard adapted The Da Vinci Code and Angels and Demons. I think it comes from somewhere a place of ego because The Guide is a great film. I think Angels and Demons is a great fun film for somebody who's not read the book. I don't think a writer. It's like that. I posted something on Instagram which got a lot of engagement. There's this line from Midnight in Paris by Woody Allen, where a young and upcoming author meets a fictional Hemingway, and he goes to him and says, "Will you read my novel? And will you read the manuscript?" And he says, "How long is it?" He says, "It's 400 pages." He says, "No, I hate it." He says, "Yeah, but you haven't even read it." And he says, "Look, if it's good, then I'll hate it because I haven't come up with it myself. And if it's bad, then I'll hate it anyway. Never ask another writer for an opinion."
I remember this. Yeah, that actually makes sense, and I think and that's also. I mean, you've hit the hammer on the nail, right? I mean, for a person who's read the book, and I think my first experience with this was with the Harry Potter books because those are the first like book to movie adaptations I saw in my life, right? And I had certain images of certain characters in my head. Some of them lived up, like were close to it. Some of them were just way off, right? Like I had a very different image of Luna Lovegood in my head, and even though like the character was quite cool, it just didn't fit really well with me. So I think that's just going to be there, I suppose. Like there's just going to be, unless like we start having a disproportionate part of the population who starts reading more. Like I think right now, like it's quite obvious it's a minuscule population that reads and a large part doesn't. So for them, watching the film isn't really like watching a rehash of the movie of the book, right? So
also what happens is in book the textual format allows you to go into details that are very very nuanced, which cinema as a video format does not. For example, in Gone Girl, I haven't read the film, but I haven't watched the film, but I've spoken to enough people who have. And in Gone Girl, when I was reading it, one of my favorite parts of the book was the whole 90s. Where she's in the voiceover, she speaks about those mixtape of the 90s, and I believe the film was set in contemporary America. So you just lost that whole disconnect. So for a reader, you'd be so upset that, you've not taken one of the best parts of the book, but also at the same time to sound contradictory and to play the devil's advocate, there is certain text that you cannot translate onto screen. A great voiceover about the 90s does not translate well for the screen because when an audience is watching, they'll be wondering what the hell is going on. Versus, so it's this dichotomy that's always going to exist. But I feel books are always better than their on-screen adaptations. I don't think there's any discussion on that.
Right. And even the bit about, so personally what I also feel is that books, so the author has the luxury of trying to engage you on all levels and all of your senses, right? Like an author can write, when say if they're describing a scene where you're meeting a lover for the first time, so you can describe how they look, how they feel, how they smell, everything. Like you can describe literally everything around it. A movie maker or a filmmaker doesn't really have that liberty, right? Like they have that scene to show. They can always try and be subtle about it or be loud about it, but they cannot. I mean, it's very difficult to communicate smell through a film, like through what's being shown on screen, right?
Also, there's the paucity of time. A film has to end in 120 minutes, but even with series. So if you even look at the Game of Thrones, it's 50, 60, 70 hours of content. But it's still not as long as the books because you still have to wrap up an episode in 50 minutes. A chapter you can spend days with on a book. A book can be 1,000 pages long and it's great. I mean, look at Tolkien, look at the Lord of the Rings. I mean, you can murder somebody with that book, So you can just bludgeon somebody to death. But you can spend more time on it, whereas on video you have that paucity of time, which also dictates a lot.
No, I kind of get it. Like very recently, A Suitable Boy was adapted and was done by Meera Nair. It had a stellar cast, and everyone had like huge expectations about it. And from what I understand, none of the readers are very satisfied with it. They're like, it's a very good attempt, but it cuts out a lot from the book. Because A Suitable Boy is a 1,500-page book. And it's been cut down to 6-hour-long episode. And people who haven't read it, and watched the show, they quite liked the show. They were like, it's a very nice show and it's very well done. There are these nuances that are what. So I think that's just something that's I think all of us will have to make our peace with, I suppose. So Marsh, just to wrap up this episode, what's next for you? I know you mentioned that you might be writing Zoravar too, but you also mentioned a standalone novel which you had in your mind. Is that something you want to talk about?
Yeah, so there were two that I pitched to Harper Collins, and thankfully they've liked the ideas enough to commission them. But everything's gone for a tizzy now that I have to immerse myself in Zoravar too, and I do want to. I also don't want to have too long a gap, so I get where they're coming from, and this has been a response from a lot of readers. In fact, I mean, to forsake vanity for a second here, but to every single review says that, hey, what next? What next? What next? Where is it? So I also selfishly do not want to lose on that momentum and take far too long. I'm not George R.R. Martin or Patrick, Rothfuss that I can take 10 years. Maybe I can do it for the third one, if you know what I'm saying. But if the first two come out in quick succession, the third one can take 3 years, and because by then you've built your community of people who hopefully the book has resonated with. So I also don't want to take too long. But what I actually wanted to do was something very different. I mean, I won't go into complete details yet, but I wanted to do this incredibly erotic book that I had in mind. And it's set, it's as contemporary as it gets. It's got a very millennial focused sort of protagonist. It is a millennial protagonist, and so it's not in the 50 Shades of Grey erotic, but it's more contextual, and there's a lot of politics in it. So I'll have to be a little careful. There's a lot of world events, and it's basically 9 nights that he spends with 9 different women. And in grade. So that is what I wanted to do, completely different from all of this. In fact, that would be my attempt to sort of try and do an indie sort of experiment. Other than that, there is another series that I have in mind. Again, nothing to do with cinema, but that's like even harder pulp fiction. I mean, if you think Zoravar was hard pulp fiction, this one is like literally 9x more hard pulp fiction.
Oh, wow, okay.
And on this one, I want to have everything from zombies to vampires to to a stolen bag of money, and smugglers smuggling brown sugar and cocaine, that sort of a series that I want to do. And that's an unlimited series, literally. I mean, if it does well, I could do 25 books. More in the James Hadley Chase sort of.
Right. This just shows me how filmy you are. Like, you're vampires and zombies, but there has to be that stolen bag of money in the story. That has to be there. But Maharsh, it was really fun talking to you. Thank you for coming to our podcast. Hope you had a good time.
No, it was wonderful, Siddharth, and I honestly, amongst all the conversations that I've had, and not to demean or bemoan or anything, but this has actually been such a fun chat that, when you said we are coming to close, I said, "Arey yaar, abhi to 10 minute hue hain sirf," But it was really, really, really wonderful chatting. And honest to God advice to you, I've studied somewhat, I've spent so much time now talking to you. Uh, don't think so much. Just write your stuff. Don't. I think you're overthinking it. You're overanalyzing it. You're going a little hard on yourself, and you're worrying too much about how it will pan out. Just let it flow. Please, you must do that. I'll check up on you in a month and see if you're still at it or not. Don't worry whether it's, don't be. I think you're taking it a little hard on yourself. You're being a little overtly conscious about what you're writing.
A lot of my friends would definitely agree with you on this, but yeah, I'll take your word for this. I'm actually going to start with something now. It actually makes sense. I mean, I get where you're coming from, and hearing how you went about it, it just kind of makes me. I know. Very honestly, seeing something like Zoravar out there and getting the reception it is, it makes me even more like, I know, frees me up a bit about thinking about writing, because I do see a bit of my writing style in yours. So I think if you do get that good a reception, I think I would be able to maybe manage like about 10% of it.
I would tell this to a lot of people कि यार अगर मैं writer बन सकता हूँ तो मेरे हिसाब से कोई भी बन सकता है, honestly. Because I mean, but really, I think you should give it a shot. And I'll tell you another thing is that, at the end of the day, I think ours is the only business in the world, writing novels or writing movies or making series. You cannot, once it's out there, unless if you're manufacturing ball bearings, for example, and it's a faulty product, you recall it from the market. Any other form of business, the product is a constant. It's not like, for example, if there's Colgate toothpaste, you may or may not like it, but it's the same thing for a billion people. Books are one thing that you could have. If a billion people read it, you'll have a billion interpretations of it. So you're so dependent on, I wouldn't say validation, but your success depends on other people validating your work. That's why I don't think you should second guess yourself at all, because you can't control it. You don't know how it's going to pan out. I think you should just give it, and again, we'd like to go into detail, but maybe at a meta philosophical time at another time. But you just do what comes naturally to and what you feel is right. Also, you'll never feel it's right, because then you want to keep going back and be embarrassed about what you've written.
Right.
But at a certain point, you have to let it go, make it happen, and then just leave it for people to see whether it resonates or not. Because nobody can. I don't think. I mean, Steven Spielberg can't control the box office outcome of his film. Jeffrey Archer can't control how his next big book will do. So,
fair enough. Okay, that's actually some lovely advice. Like, I think you've given me a lot to think about. So
just go for it. No, that's what. Don't think. Just go for it.
Yeah. Okay. That's what I'm going to do. So on that note, we'll come to the end of this podcast. It was lovely talking to you. Bye-bye.
Likewise, Siddharth. It was great being here, and thank you so much for having me here. And I look forward to all your other episodes and recommendations.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or to this podcast on any platform that you like. And also check us out on Instagram or on our website. We do put up a lot of content about books through interviews and live discussions, posts about books. And if you love reading, you're definitely going to enjoy this. Thank you for tuning in, and please leave your comments as feedback. Thank you so much.